Hi everyone, I'm glad you're back. I'm still Seth, and in this session, I thought it would be good for us to get into a little more depth with the appspec file. Just as a disclaimer, keep in mind that we are specifically referring to the appspec file utilized for EC2 and on-prem instance fleet deployments, and not for Lambda. Because this is one of the most important parts of AWS Code Deploy, our introduction of this component will go a little deeper in order to give you a good foundation so that you can better continue your self-paced study and hands-on practice. As I mentioned before, the Code Deploy appspec file is where you get the control over how your revision deployments are managed and what they do on your fleets. This is where you state what is done, the ordering, and how you determine if a deployment was successful. It is important to note that the appspec file isn't the actual document where you script the work being done by the Code Deploy agent. Instead, it is the outline of how the agent will perform its functions. So while crucial to your use of Code Deploy, the appspec file isn't a complicated document that requires a large learning curve. Just some understanding of the sections and a little practice. Moving on, there are several parts of an appspec file that we are going to go into. The parts of the file are the version, OS, files, permissions, and hooks. The version and OS are the simplest parts. For version, this is the Code Deploy appspec version and not the version of your specific application or deployment. Currently, the only accepted value is 0.0. The OS, as many of you have guessed, is for operating system. There are only two valid options here, Linux or Windows. And with that, our first two sections of the appspec file are complete. Our next section is the files section. This is optional and is only necessary if you are going to be copying files to the instances in your fleet. I'll say this now as it pertains to the rest of the sections because they are all optional. If you are not using a section within the file, you should not include it at all. If you include an incomplete section or leave a section blank, you have a risk of failing a deployment. This includes the files, permissions, and the hooks sections. So back to the files section. As I stated, this is for any files you're going to be moving onto the instance. As you see, it has a source and a destination subsection. These locations refer to the locations of the to-be-copied files from your revision package. Starting at the root level of your revision package, you can specify where in the revision to copy the files from, and then the destination directory location on the instance in the destination part. The permissions section is also an optional part of the file. This refers to the permissions you want to apply to the files being copied in the Files section. Use of the Files portion does not necessitate use of permissions, but the use of permissions does require that you are using the Files portion. I won't go through every part of the permissions, but I do want to state that if you use permissions, the one required part within permissions that you must include is the Object section. Object refers to the set of system files, folders, or directories that the specified permissions are applied to after the file system objects are copied to the instance. Additionally, permissions is only used for Linux deployments and is not used for Windows. The last section we are going to review is the hooks section. This is optional, but also important if you are going to use it. The hooks direct the Code Deploy agent as to what it needs to do and when. The hooks that you can utilize are application stop, before install, after install, application start, and validate service. Each of these is used to run your specified script at the time of the utilized hook. There is an additional lifecycle stage that you cannot use to trigger a script, and that is install. In Code Deploy, The install stage is just the stage where it copies over the files from the source to the destination. Keep in mind that you do not have to use every hook, but only the ones that are needed with your deployment. If you do not want to use one of the hooks, you should omit it completely, just like with the optional sections of the overall appspec file. The application stop and start is used for anything you need to do to stop and start the application being updated. The before and after install hooks are used for the scripts that you need to run before the installation happens and after the installation is complete. Lastly, you can use the validate service hook to run any scripts that you will use to test and make sure that everything has been installed and started correctly. As you've likely noticed, all of the hook subsections are laid out the same way. They all refer to the scripts that you will be running by specifying the location of the script, the timeout you want to allow for it to run, and if you're running a Linux deployment, run as refers to the level at which you want to run the script. If you want to run multiple scripts at any of the hooks, you do so by specifying the separate locations and grouping each location with its accompanied timeout and run as. That's it for what we are going to cover at this level. If you get deeper into code deploy, you will find that there are additional things that you can do with the appspec file, but these sections are the most utilized and will allow you to get started with your use of the service. In the next section, we will cover the deployment styles that you can utilize. I'll see you then.